Okay, good. So here's what we're going to cover. We're going to start with the why of vertical facilitation, and then we're going to move into the what of vertical facilitation. And in a sense, the next two parts are about the how of vertical facilitation. So we refer to this as the activity of vertical facilitation, what we actually are doing in real time, and then the design thinking behind that informs vertical facilitation. So we're going to give a lot of texture to all of us. And again, the invitation is for you to consider how might this deepen what you already may be doing? Because most of us are already doing a lot of this stuff. How might you and the people you work with benefit from this? And then finally, what new possibilities might this open up in your work and organizations and even in your life? Because many people tell us that this work is life changing. Okay, so why vertical facilitation? Well, I don't know about you. If you've maybe some of you have noticed that there's some stuff going on in the world right now, right? So
That's
we've got
interesting.
things like climate change, the issue of sustainability, and these are big questions. Like the question around sustainability, is the notion of continuous economic growth truly sustainable? And the notion of continuous economic growth is the very foundation of how we understand economic health. And so there's a huge dilemma there, right? Authoritarianism. People are afraid
Mm.
of the emerging complexity in which we find ourselves. And different people have different ways of reacting. And one of them is to sort of reach for somebody to tell them what to do, to answer their fears and questions for them.
Mm.
Conflict, rising conflict. So there's all these things that are going on in the world around us. And of course, we could continue to add bubbles here, couldn't we? And then if we look in the organizations in which we work, most of us, maybe all of us, in some way work with organizations. So sustainable pace is a big question. Innovation. So a lot of executive leaders these days are talking about how can we bring about innovation in a complex and unpredictable world. Social responsibility increasingly is becoming a big deal. Agility, of course. So these all fall into the category of what we call wicked problems. And I don't know, some years ago at STUS, they declared that these are not so much problems, but more like messes. You can't, with a mess, you can't really solve the mess, can you? You can try to solve it, but it doesn't behave like an ordinary problem, most of these problems. So we can't really solve them, but we can grow beyond them.
Mm.
And that's the basic foundation for what vertical facilitation is about. It's about helping ourselves and others grow beyond the wicked problems that we and they face. So, some definitions. I like to actually read things on the text. There's some research that shows that, in terms of neuroscience, that reading things that people are also looking at helps to uh, uh, get it into our consciousness more. Vertical facilitation is a manner of leaderfully interacting with others in ways that deliberately catalyze vertical learning. And we're going to say what we mean by vertical learning in just a moment. But you could say, and at least initially, that it's a learning by which we grow beyond the challenges we face. So it's a different kind of learning, as we're going to see, right? And we don't bring about this kind of learning in the way that we bring about ordinary learning. So already we want to start to appreciate the unique quality of this learning that we're looking at here. It's not about telling people models, all the stuff that we're doing here today. It's not about that.
Okay, okay. Give yourself a break. Like a foundation of cognitive tools is useful, right? And that's what
Yes,
we're
it is.
after
Yeah.
today, right?
Yeah, it's great. Great. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Okay, so then vertical learning. You could say, and there's lots of different ways we might talk about vertical learning, or vertical development is another term for this. It's becoming more of a big deal. We're hearing more about it, but I like to say that vertical learning is a form of learning in which there's a shift in how people make sense of their world. So oftentimes, in fact, when Lisa and I first started talking about vertical learning, we talked about it specifically and almost exclusively in terms of the adult development, the inner meaning making aspect of it. And while that's part of it, we've come to see vertical learning as also including that learning by which we become more cognizant of our interactions, the conversational patterns that also determine how we collectively understand. So we're going to sort of open the aperture a little bit on this notion of vertical learning and take it out of the exclusive realm of adult development and bring it into the realm of discourse and conversation. And we'll say more about that as we proceed. Vertical learning has happened. So how do we know that it's happened? It's happened when people are being and acting in ways that are more generative, resourceful, and capable. It's a little bit like tennis. I don't know if any of you ever play tennis. I don't play tennis and probably shouldn't even talk about tennis. But from what I've heard from people who do know something about tennis, is that it's very different to learn how to play tennis. So, as opposed to understanding the nature of tennis. And so, part of becoming a great tennis player is understanding the game of tennis. But to become a really great tennis player doesn't mean you have to know everything about tennis. And at least in terms of knowledge, that it's a different way of knowing. It's not the kind of empirical way of knowing that we ordinarily think of. And again, we're going to say more about that as we go along. So you could say, in fact, we assert that vertical learning is the key learning dimension in a complex and unpredictable world. That we already know how to learn what we need to learn about what we do. What we aren't so good at is learning about how we think, being able to be attentive to how we think in order to transform how we think into modes of thinking. And by the way, when I say thinking, I include feeling, I include the spiritual realm, the emotional realm, all of it. All of that is thinking, but it's becoming aware of the manner of our thinking such that we can render a quality of thinking that is up to the challenges that we face. Okay, that's one little arc.
Mm.
Now we're going to start another arc. And this arc is about what we mean by sense making. And you could say that sense making is a very dreary, humdrum kind of thing. It's what happens in these moments, everyday moments. We see this all the time. Everywhere that people are working, you see these kinds of things where people are together and they're having a conversation. And you could say that in organizations, in any kind of human social systems that are oriented around getting stuff done, that the primary vehicle is sense making. That you could almost say that all there is sense making. And so, what do we want to say about sense making? So, we want to kind of unpack what we mean by sense making. So, at any given moment, there is the action and the content of what people are doing. So, and this is where we usually focus our attention. Probably in these last 10 minutes, most of your attention has been focused on the content of what of what's being presented here. I myself have been constantly scanning the screen to look to see, what's happening, right? So I'm paying attention to the content and to something else, and many of you may be as well. And that something else that we're going to talk about now, we might refer to as the process by which we take action and content, or the process that informs our action and the content of what we're up to. And the process is what we might refer to as sense making. And sense making as a process, there's a behavioral aspect. So there's the interactions, there's the communication, there's the conversational patterns, who speaks, who doesn't speak. There's all of that kind of stuff which we can observe, which we can say is the behavioral dimension of the process of sense making, the process by which action and content is determined. But there's also another layer, an invisible layer, you could say. The behavioral layer is visible, although we don't usually pay attention to it. But we can point to it, right? We could watch a video and we can discern patterns of conversation, patterns of interaction, from which we can learn a lot that would inform and improve the behavioral aspect of our sense making. But to discern the meaning making takes something different, that we have to work in a little bit different way. Vertical facilitation works in both of these domains, right? But this is where ordinarily we almost never focus. It's the invisible layer. It's there, but we don't pay attention to it. And yet it determines our action and our content. And if you look at this more broadly across social systems like organizations, you can see that we're blind to much of what's going on at any given moment. Is this clear so far? Does this feel compelling?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Actually, I was really interested in knowing, I'm watching you all, I'm watching Michael, I'm sensing the field. I'm really curious of what has been vivid so far.
Yeah, yeah.
And as we go forward, when something is vivid to you, because I'm noticing many of you writing notes. So when something is vivid to you, maybe it's a typical thing you would take a note for. If you are so inclined, also put it in the chat because that will create a lot of richness
Mm,
for all of us to learn together at this same time.
yeah.
So if you're willing
Yeah.
to give that gift to yourself and to other people, also put those things in the chat. When they happen.
Yeah. So already that was a vertical facilitation move, because it's about inviting people. It's a moment in which we create a condition that increases our sense-making intelligence. Right. Um, so indeed, this is where vertical facilitation is focused. So let's revise our definition of vertical facilitation. Now we could say that vertical facilitation is a process by which we bring attention, to the process aspects of people's sense making that determines their actions. Now, lest you think that vertical facilitation is this rarefied thing that you do, I want to say something to the contrary of that, that vertical facilitation, it's a it's a in a sense, it's a layer that we add to what we're already doing, right? So you might be facilitating a product planning meeting, and you could certainly bring in moments, what we often call moments of vertical facilitation. So when you go through our programs, you'll hear this a lot. Um, People sometimes get worried, oh my God, does this mean that I'm going to have to create special meetings and special sessions, that's just about helping us expose the process of our sense making? No. Only on rare occasions is that the case. It's much more about feathering in moments and layers of vertical facilitation practice into what you're already doing. including if what you're already doing is creating transformative workshops, which some of you do. Okay.
Mhm.
All right. So two facets of vertical facilitation. Are we seeing things in the chat?
Oh, lots, lots.
Oh yeah,
So,
great.
so just to know about Michael, I'm the chat monitor during these things. When he's on a roll with content, he cannot look over there. But
Mm,
yeah, so it's so what's happening, Michael? In the chat is really beautiful because it's not only comments on the content that are happening,
mm.
it's comments on what people are noticing about themselves and others. It's also comments about how this is going overall, more to the questions you offered in the invitation at the beginning, like how
Awesome.
people are apprehending this related to what they're already doing. So
Yeah,
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 keep it coming. This is
yeah.
very
Awesome.
it's nourishing for me to see these comments. Is it
Yeah,
nourishing for others? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Keep them.
yeah, yeah. Okay. Yeah. And indeed,
Great.
welcome, Mana
I'm
Lija,
guessing Manali Shah. Okay.
Manali Shah, Manali Shah. Okay, I'm just getting my tongue twisted.
And probably
Welcome.
Manali is this person's first name, but we'll see.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Welcome.
Cool. All right. All right. So that was the second arc. Now we're going to move into a third arc, a new arc. So we're going to what we want to do now, and this is a longer arc. We want to examine vertical facilitation. So we've established a way of understanding what we mean by vertical learning, and particularly as it relates to this thing that we're calling sense making. And we've established that vertical learning isn't just limited to the adult developmental way of defining it, that it also includes the relationship and conversational and dialogical practices in which we engage in the very process by which we come to make sense of the world. So,
Mhm.
so now we're going to move into vertical facilitation, and we want to establish that there are essentially two facets, if you will, of vertical facilitation. They sort of exist in different realms, and the first facet is what we refer to as the activity of vertical facilitation, which is how we operate and what we do and who we need to be in real time as we are facilitating. And then there's the design dimension. So we're going to walk through each of these in turn. We're going to start with the activity of vertical facilitation. And it all starts with sensing, 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 sensing. Like right now, we're going to pause for a moment and you can sense. And so vertical facilitation is about sensing, sensing, sensing. We're going to tell you in a moment what you're sensing, what the things you're paying attention to in your sensing. But you're sensing and sensing and sensing. You're staying with the sensing. And then at some point, you feel an urge to take some action, to make some movement, to say something. And then you take that action, you make that move, you say that thing, and then you move right back to the stance of sensing, sensing, sensing. What was the impact of that? How did it land? Is there something I might need to clean up? Because a part of this urge and act is having permission to act, not, in a way that's disrespectful or a way that it's acting in a way which is absolutely respecting and results from your attentiveness to what's actually going on. Okay.
Yeah, I want to say something about that. It's also acting in a way that is brave and possibly unexpected.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's
Right.
saying the thing that is there that no one else wants to say. And possibly they're so conditioned to the situation, they're not even aware of this incredible constriction in their energy or their capabilities. It's saying the thing that is a little bit dicey, you know? And as Michael said, with respect.
Yeah.
But with the respect that comes from not capitulating or not colluding with their own limiting beliefs, thoughts, actions, right?
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
one that's quite courageous.
That is such an important point because most of us, this is where most of us fall into becoming overly uh, cautious.
Hmm. Hmm.
And 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 there's a dance here, and a big part of what gets covered, especially in level two, the deep dive of this curriculum, is really about coming to grips, coming to your own edges, because we all have personal edges that constrict us. And to the degree we can free ourselves from those constrictions, that very freedom creates a space, makes it possible for others around us to choose to free themselves from their constrictions.
Hmm. Yeah.
So, in other words, vertical facilitation, a big part of it has to do with how we're being.
Hmm.
Okay, so what are we paying attention to? Um, by the way, we're just kind of glancing over some of this stuff. We go much more deeply, of course, into the courses. One of the things we're paying attention to is individuals. What's happening with individuals? So when I'm in a Zoom room, or certainly when I'm in a physical room, I'm like watching, like, what's happening with this person? How's this landing for Dilek? What's going on with John DB? I'm not quite sure if that's your name, John. Um, or what's up with ESBR? And so, like, paying attention to individuals and what might be their meaning making, that may be informing their actions, their behaviors. The other thing we're paying attention to is interrelationships. So not just individuals, but how people interrelate with one another. What's the quality of relationship? Is it constricted? Is it open? Is it kind of jokey, but in a barbed way? You've been around these people where they joke around, but it has a certain sting to it, like it's a little hurtful in a certain way, right? So there are all these different qualities of interrelations. And then there's the sense of the field, which is sensing the overall mood or the tone or the energy of a given group or team. Like even right now, we can sense the mood, the feeling of it. And if we had a few minutes, we might even invite you to put into the chat, and you can even do so if you'd like. What's the mood that you're sensing here? I'm sensing attentiveness, that people are sort of like really attentive and present. There's a sense of alive presence is what I'm sensing. And of course, in any field, there's always going to be lots of different things. It's a little bit like a fine wine has lots of different qualities.
I'm going to go ahead and bring in a deeper piece about the field since Gareth is taking us there already. Gareth put in the chat, can we also add co to this as in co-sensing, shared meaning making,
Hmm.
emerging from within the space we're holding together? Yeah, there's
Yeah,
something about being attentive to the field and noticing sort of the emotional tone of it. But Gareth, you're exactly right. There's something much deeper going on in the field. Like
yeah,
this emergence is arising from our individuals, interrelations, and other things
yeah,
that the field itself is actually quite intelligent.
yes.
You
And
know.
we can feel that in this system here,
Mhm. Mm.
right? So like if we were doing an actual piece of this work, we might continue to engage in that sort of co-sensing and
Mhm.
collaborative sense making,
Yeah.
in which what emerges is a new kind of intelligence.
Yeah.
So all of that is possible in the domain of the field when we sense into the field. Another thing we're paying attention to is the content, right? So much of the time there is some content around which we're oriented, whether it's the content of a product planning meeting or the content of a workshop. A lot of people bring these vertical facilitation practices into any manner of workshops that they're doing. And it's
Mm.
just, again, it's this adding another layer. But one of the things we're paying attention to is the content. How does it seem to be landing? Where is it confusing? You know, am I getting overly hung up on the content, for instance, which is one of the things that sometimes happens with me, which brings me to the final sort of thing we're paying attention to. We call these the 5 windows of attention, is the self. What's going on with me? Where am I a little stuck? Am I open? Is my heart open? Can I allow myself to really feel people? Am I being limited by some thought that I have? Maybe some concern. Maybe I'm worried about something. How is this going? Do people like it? Do people like me? There's all this stuff on in our head. And when the heat gets higher, that more and more of that kind of stuff, the heat gets higher in us. Okay, so those are the 5 windows of attention, what we're paying attention to at any given moment. And they're kind of like the meters on an airplane cockpit. I think, Lisa, doesn't John
My
fly?
husband John is a private pilot, and so years ago we got this metaphor from him. You know,
Uh-huh.
he's like, so when people teach you how to fly, they tell you you have to scan all these meters, and you all have seen what an airplane cockpit looks like. There are dozens and dozens of gauges and meters and readouts and all that. You have to scan them every 10 seconds. And obviously, if something gets your attention, then you have to pay attention to that. But you
Yeah.
cannot lose the scanning aspect, even when something has your rapt attention because it's, urgent.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's the metaphor that we like to use here is that these are 5 windows that we're constantly scanning when we're working with groups of people in whatever context we're
Yeah.
working.
Yeah. And much of what happens, especially in the deep dive and in the advanced course, is getting powerful facility in noticing where you tend to get stuck, because we all tend to get stuck in one of these or another. And to be able to unstick yourself, to be able to kind of, there's a thing that happens when you can relax your attention aperture. The aperture is the thing in the camera that determines how much light gets in. And there's a certain thing that happens as you get good at that. Okay, so now let's move to the second facet, which is the design aspect of vertical facilitation. So so we've been talking about the activity, which is the real-time aspect of when we're facilitating. The design has to do with the kinds of things we think about as we are considering and contemplating the design of some occasion that would include moments of vertical facilitation. And so there's a certain kind of design ethos or certain kind of design model, if you will. But it starts with the observation that vertical learning does not happen through instruction, right? So I years ago I co-led leadership courses with a certain person who I'm not going to say, and it was about talking. It was about presenting concepts related to leadership and how it relates to adult development. Interesting concepts, but not transformative, right? The presentation of concepts does not itself elicit transformation. Something different needs to happen. That consider that vertical learning happens by deliberately shaping a particular kind of learning environment. So we have this photo of these children, yeah, and they're outdoors and they're engaged in a kind of science experiment and they're trying things and there's all so much is going on. And I can imagine that the teacher was a vertical facilitator, was created, designed this moment or designed these moments in order to not only bring about conceptual learning, but some other kind of learning, some kind of learning that reaches more deeply into the heart and soul of these young children. And that's what we want to look at. What's the nature of such a learning environment? And so it starts with this notion of a holding environment. It comes from the work of Donald Winnicott and later Robert Keegan. Donald Winnicott was a child psychologist, one of those two, and he worked a lot with children. And what he and other developmental psychologists notice is that there are basically three things that need to be present in order to facilitate, to catalyze what we're calling vertical learning. And the first of these is psychological challenge. That something about the environment has to call into question some current psychological equilibrium, but not so much so that it terrifies people, but enough so that it's a little bit of an edge. And the second element here is psychological support. And you can see how these two really need to happen together. Without enough psychological support, challenge can be too much. Without enough challenge, support becomes kind of, like a happy summer camp. We're having a nice time, but we're not really growing. And then finally, specific learning tools that are specific to the nature of the occasion and the environment that we're working with. Okay, so we talk about vertical facilitation, we kind of extrapolate from this into four meta design elements. And this is another sort of model aspect of this. And the first is that it's an environment that engenders heat experiences. So the posing of reflective and situational challenges that orient new sense-making categories. And sometimes, in fact, we often use the word disorienting dilemmas, that a heat experience presents a kind of disorienting dilemma. It's a dilemma in which people have the experience in which the way in which they are making sense of a particular situation is insufficient, but it's a dilemma because they don't yet know what else might be there, or what's being presented to them is emotionally challenging or psychologically challenging. And so it's a little bit hard. Oftentimes, heat experiences show up as it's a little edgy, a little emotionally difficult. Other times, it shows up as a kind of insight. And so, Lisa, I want to use maybe the example of from coaching agile teams.
Oh yeah. Yeah, yeah.
So years ago, Lisa and I and Michael Spade used to teach these courses, and one of which was called Coaching Agile Teams. And
Mhm.
among the things we would teach is particular professional coaching techniques, and one of them was um, level two listening.
Yeah, it's so funny. Because it's just pay attention to how sort of mundane this is
Uh-huh.
and how
Yes.
heat experience does not have to be super fancy.
Hmm.
So we would introduce people to the concepts of three different levels of listening. And it would be about 5 minutes of introduction to these concepts. And then we would move them directly into this exercise. And the exercise would simply be this: you're going to turn to the person near you. You are going to listen to them talk to you about something important to them for about 60 or 90 seconds, not a long time. And your job is to pay attention to how you're listening. Are you listening at level one or at level two? And when you realize you're listening at level one, can you bring yourself back to level two? It doesn't matter so much that you all don't know what the level one and level two, and possibly you do, depending on if you had that specific professional coaching school. But but notion, this notion that you could be useful without talking was so disorienting to people, because what they would hear back is, wow, that was weird, but that was really good.
Hmm.
That, it's so people are struggling with their own cognitive structures about listening, but then finding out that everything they thought about listening maybe wasn't as useful as they previously imagined.
So that would be a disorienting dilemma because it is disorienting, right?
Mhm.
And so then, now the process continues, right? And so we introduce now stretch practices. And stretch practices are personal, collective, conversational practices that psychoactivate developmental growth. I know that's a mouthful. Basically, what it does is it takes the heat experience and through a set of repeated exposure to that which generated the heat experience, it deepens the insight of that heat experience so that it now has some stickiness to it. So, an example, going back to the coaching agile teams, is that we would introduce level two listening, the thing that Lisa just described, but we would repeat it several times over the subsequent 3 days, so that by the end of that 3 days, a big aha. It's not just a temporary insight. It's like literally a different way of going about interacting with people. And so we would hear from people months later, even years later, how sticky, how that insight persisted and altered the way that they interact with people. So that's an example of the power of heat, the combination of experiences and stretch practices. So you need both of these, but not only these, you also need a social container in which this sort of developmental listening gets activated. So one of the things that happened in the coaching agile teams class is we would deliberately create this social environment in which people would share their insights or share their dilemmas. And we created this as a safe but challenging space in which when people shared, there was genuine reception. People would emotionally receive it. And in the kind of hmm, the blanket, the comfort of that receiving, people felt encouraged, which deepened the insight all the more. And then finally, the bigger game. So a bigger game is simply eliciting a commitment to something that's a little bit bigger than what people ordinarily do. And so, for instance, in the coaching agile teams class, we elicited a commitment with people, a commitment to their own development, not just learning techniques, and scoring, points as to, how many new concepts they've learned. But we fashioned it as a way of their own inner development. And so that became the bigger game. And so when you combine these four in this sort of alchemical manner, you create that sort of environment in which what emerges, because it is emergent, is this thing we're calling vertical learning, this otherwise elusive quality of learning that can't be, you know, instigated purely through the introduction of concepts or ideas or even exercises, by the way, or games.
Mhm.
That
And
all
all
four of
those,
these,
yeah, and all those exercises and games can be put to use in this way.
yes,
But unless they have all four of these elements, the insight they produce is unlikely to be long lasting. It's unlikely to create a shift in how people make sense of the world and therefore how they are more able to deal with the complex challenges that are right in front of them.
yeah, yeah, right, right. So, okay, so we're kind of just we're partly introducing these things conceptually, but we're also evoking something. So, Lisa and I and all of you together, we've been evoking something here. So the nature of our shared understanding here is deeper than just purely conceptual understanding, I would assert.
Mhm.
But we're going to continue because we have about
Just one more concept.
yeah, that's right, indeed. And so this is the kind of the last. uh, this is a kind of a shorter arc, but we want to point to the vertical facilitation competency domains. And we're just going to do this rather briefly. The first and probably the most important of which is being. How we are being as catalysts of vertical learning that, like was mentioned a moment ago, that to the degree that we can be comfortable with the discomfort of disorienting dilemmas, it helps other people feel more comfortable or at least more willing to go there. And so there are really two main qualities of being. The first is presence. And we often talk about being present, like being like able to be attentive to all that's going on, like having that aperture wide open, but also having presence, projecting a sense of presence so that people can feel the challenge and the safety of your own presence, that somebody is holding the space. So that's what we mean by presence. And then there's this notion of a stand, which we introduce in level one in the warm up part of the curriculum, but get very deeply into your stand. And so part of the foundational assertion of this work is that to the degree that we can declare for ourselves a stand that we are beyond our own psychology, beyond our own feelings, that it gives us a very powerful place to come from when we're working with groups, and especially when things get hot for us, which they often do in this sort of work. So that's the one competency domain. A second of three is in the territory of knowing, and there are basically three. So this is like basic knowledge, like having knowledge around transformation learning theory. There's a whole body of knowledge and wisdom there which we draw from, particularly in the deep dive. Also, adult development. So we draw deeply and profoundly from the field of adult development. And then finally, from relationship systems coaching. This is a vast array of work in the area of relationship systems, being able to sense systems and respond to systems in a way that's useful for them. And then finally, there's skillfulness, and there's a great number of skills. And so we're not going to list them here, but there are a number of skills that you learn, skills and practices that you learn. And that's another of the competency domains. Okay.
And I think what I want to say about all of this is that this is the introduction, possibly for many of you, to a new world
Mhm.
or a new perspective or a new confluence of ideas, because that's what I see Michael doing here. Michael is bringing together ideas from different domains based on his decades of experience, it both in and leading transformative learning environments. So long before I met Michael, he had been in that world for a very, very long time. So all of this gets unpacked.
Mhm.
Like you're
Mhm.
this will take time. These
Mhm.
models will take time for you to work with and learn and practice around and imbibe in new ways. And that's what happens in the future pieces of this. So I just want to make sure that you don't feel a certain pressure to like totally understand all this right now and like,
Mhm.
yes, I
Yeah.
totally get it. Yeah.
Yeah.
It takes some time, and because there are further layers and subtleties, and the way that you work with these models is as unique to you.
Mhm.
And that's the real beauty of this is that Michael and I, and particularly in the deep dive, because we keep those to a small number of people, we get to work directly with you,
Yeah.
and how you're applying this into your world, what's coming up for you as your own superpowers and your own limitations, and can we work with that? And yes, we do. So this is useful at this level, I would say, just to have an introduction to this knowledge. But there's more, and relax if you feel like, oh my gosh, I didn't get all those models.